good evening, and welcome to my channel. I am the Loyal Hufflepuff, and today we'll be going over our new book in new series that we'll be reading through, Goosebumps. This is the second book, which is titled Stay Out of the Basement. Again, this is the second book of the series. I'm not sure if we have the first book at home, but I've checked, and this is our most recent book so far. And I can't compare it to the show or the movies. But once we finish this, hopefully we'll get a better understanding of where we're at. And if you've seen this show or watched the movies and are familiar with the book, please comment down below so that way I can look into it as well. But without further ado, let's start reading Goosebumps. Hey, Dad, catch! Casey tossed the frisbee across the smooth green lawn. Casey's dad made a face, squinting into the sun. The frisbee hit the ground and skipped a few times before landing under the hedge at the back of the house. Not today. I'm busy, Dr. Brewer said, and abruptly turned and loped into the house. The screen door slammed behind him. Casey brushed his straight blonde hair back off his forehead. What's his problem? He called to Margaret, his sister, who had watched the whole scene from the side of the redwood garage. You know, Margaret said quietly. She wiped her hands on the legs of her jeans and held them both up, inviting a toss. I'll play frisbee with you for a little while, she said. Okay, Casey said without enthusiasm. He walked slowly over to retrieve the frisbee from under the hedge. Margaret moved closer. She felt sorry for Casey. He and their dad were really close, always playing ball or frisbee or Nintendo together. But Dr. Brewer didn't seem to have time for that anymore. Jumping up to catch the frisbee, Margaret realized she felt sorry for herself too. Dad hadn't been the same to her either. In fact, he spent so much time down in the basement, he barely said a word to her. He doesn't even call me princess anymore, Margaret thought. It was a nickname she hated, but at least it was a nickname, a sign of closeness. She tossed the red frisbee back. A bad toss. Casey chased after it, but it sailed away from him. Margaret looked up to the golden hills beyond their backyard. California, she thought. It's so weird out here. Here it is, the middle of winter, and there isn't a cloud in the sky. And Casey and I are out in jeans and t-shirts as if it were in the middle of summer. She made a diving catch for a wild toss, rolling over on the manicured lawn and raising the frisbee above her head triumphantly. Show off, Casey muttered, unimpressed. You're the hot dog in the family, Margaret called. Well, you're a dork. Hey, Casey, you want to play with me or not? You want me to play with you or not? He shrugged. Everyone was so edgy these days, Margaret realized. It was easy to figure out why. She made a high toss. The frisbee sailed over Casey's head. You chase it, he cried angrily, putting his hands on his hips. No, you, she cried. You. Casey, you're 11 years old. Don't act like a 2-year-old, she snapped. Well, you act like a 1-year-old, was his reply as he grudgingly went after the frisbee. It was all his dad's fault, Margaret realized. It was all Dad's fault, Margaret realized. Things had been so tense ever since he started working at home, down in the basement with his plants and weird machines. He hardly ever came up for air, and when he did, he wouldn't catch a frisbee or spend 2 minutes with either of them. Mom had noticed it too, Margaret thought, running full out and making another grand stand. Catch a grandstand catch just before colliding with the side of the garage. Having Dad home what has made Mom really tense too. She pretends everything is fine, but I can tell she's worried about him. Lucky catch, Fatso, Casey called. Margaret hated the name Fatso even more than she hated Princess. People in her family jokingly called her Fatso because she was so thin, like her father. She also was tall like him, but she also had her mother's straight brown hair, brown eyes, and dark coloring. Don't call me that. She heaved the red disc at him. He caught it at his knees and flipped it back to her. They tossed it back and forth without saying much for another 10 or 15 minutes. I'm getting hot, Margaret said, shielding her eyes from the afternoon sun with her hand. Let's go in. Casey tossed the frisbee against the garage wall. It dropped onto the grass. He came trotting over to her. Dad always plays longer, he said peevishly, and he throws better. You throw like a girl. Give me a break, Margaret groaned, giving him a playful shove as she jogged to the back door. You like you throw like a chimpanzee. How come Dad got fired? He asked. She blinked and stopped running. The question had caught her by surprise. Huh? His pale, freckled face turned serious. You know, I mean, why? He asked, obviously uncomfortable. She and Casey had never discussed this in the 4 weeks since Dad had come home, which was unusual since they were pretty close, being only a year apart. I mean, we came all the way out here so he could work at Polytech, right? Casey asked. Yeah, well, he got fired, Margaret said, half whispering in case her dad might be able to hear. But why? Did he blow up the lab or something? Casey grinned. The idea of his dad blowing up a huge campus science lab appealed to him. No, he didn't blow anything up, Margaret said, tugging at a strand of dark hair. Botanists worked with plants, you know. They don't get much of a chance to blow things up. They both laughed. Casey followed her into the narrow strip of shade cast by the low ranch style house. I'm not sure exactly what happened, Margaret continued, still half whispering, but I overheard Dad on the phone. I think he was talking to Mr. Martinez, his department head. Remember? The quiet little man who came to dinner that night the barbecue grill caught fire. Casey nodded. Martinez fired Dad? Probably, Margaret whispered. From what I overheard, it had something to do with the plants Dad was growing. Some experiments that had gone wrong or something. But Dad's real smart, Casey insisted, as if Margaret were arguing with him. If his experiments went wrong, he'd know how to fix them. Margaret shrugged. That's all I know, she said. Come on, Casey, let's go inside. I'm dying of thirst. She stuck her tongue out and moaned, demonstrating her dire need of liquid. You're gross, Casey said. He pulled open the screen door and dodged in front of her so he could get inside first. Who's gross? Mrs. Brewer asked from the sink. She turned to greet the two of them. Don't answer that. Mom looks very tired today, Margaret thought, noticing the crisscross of fine lines at the corners of her mother's eyes and the first strands of gray in her mother's shoulder-length brown hair. I hate this job, Mrs. Brewer said, turning back to the sink. What are you doing? Casey asked, pulling open the refrigerator and removing a box of juice. I'm deveining shrimp. Yuck, Margaret exclaimed. Thanks for the support, Mrs. Brewer said dryly. The phone rang. Whimpering, wiping her shrimpy hands with a dish towel, she hurried across the room to pick up the phone. Margaret got a box of juice from the fridge, popped the straw into the top, and followed Casey into the front of the hallway. The basement door, usually shut tight when Dr. Brewer was working down there, was slightly ajar. Casey started to close it, then stopped. Let's go down and see what Dad is doing, he suggested. Margaret sucked the last drops of juice through the straw and squeezed the empty box flat that flat in her hand. Okay. She knew they probably shouldn't disturb their father, but her curiosity got the better of her. He had been working down there for 4 weeks now. All kinds of interesting equipment, lights, and plants had been delivered. Most days he spent at least 8 or 9 hours down there, doing whatever it was he was doing, and he hadn't shown it to them once. Yeah, let's go, Margaret said. It was their house, too, after all. Besides, their dad was just waiting for them to show some interest. Maybe he was hurt that they hadn't bothered to come downstairs in all this time. She pulled the door open the rest of the way, and they stepped onto the narrow stairway. Hey, Dad! Casey called excitedly. Dad, can we see? They were halfway down when their father appeared at the foot of the stairs. He glared up at them angrily, his skin strangely green under the fluorescent light fixture. He was holding his right hand, drops of red blood falling onto his white lab coat. Stay out of the basement, he bellowed in a voice they'd never heard before. Both kids shrank back, surprised to hear their father scream like that. He was usually so mild and soft-spoken. Stay out of the basement, he repeated, holding his bleeding hand. Don't ever come down here. I'm warning you. That was the end of chapter 1. Now we start chapter 2. Okay, all packed, Mrs. Brewer said, dropping her suitcases with a thud in the front hallway. She poked her head into the living room where the TV was blurring. Do you think you could stop the movie for 1 minute to say goodbye to your mother? Casey pushed the button on the remote control, and the screen went blank. He and Margaret obediently walked to the hallway to give their mother hugs. Margaret's friend Diane Manning, who lived just around the corner, followed them into the hallway. How long are you going to be gone, Mrs. Brewer? She asked, her eyes on the two bulging suitcases. I don't know, Mrs. Brewer replied fretfully. My sister went into the hospital in Tucson this morning. I guess I'll have to stay until she's able to go home. Well, I'll be glad to babysit for Casey and Margaret while you're away, Diane joked. Give me a break, Margaret said, rolling her eyes. I'm older than you, Diane. And I'm smarter than both of you, Casey added with typical modesty. I'm not worried about you kids, Mrs. Brewer said, glancing nervously at her watch. I'm worried about your father. Don't worry, Margaret told her seriously. We'll take good care of him. Just make sure he eats something once in a while, Mrs. Brewer said. He's so obsessed with his work, he doesn't remember to eat unless you tell him. It's going to be really lonely around here without Mom, Margaret thought. Dad hardly ever comes up from the basement. It had been 2 weeks since he yelled at Casey and her to stay out of the basement. They had been tiptoeing around ever since, afraid to get him angry again. But in the past 2 weeks, he had barely spoken to them, except for the occasional good morning and good night. Don't worry about anything, Mom, she said, forcing a smile. Just take care of Aunt Eleanor. I'll call as soon as I get to Tucson, Mrs. Brewer said, nervously lowering her eyes to her watch again. She took 3 long strides to the basement door, and then shouted down, Michael, time to take me to the airport. After a long wait, Dr. Brewer called up a reply. Then Mrs. Brewer turned back to the kids. Think he'll even notice I'm gone? She asked in a loud whisper. She meant it to be a light remark, but her eyes revealed some sadness. A few seconds later, they heard footsteps on the basement stairs, and their dad appeared. He pulled out his stained lab coat, revealing tan slacks and a bright yellow t-shirt, and tossed the lab coat onto the banister. Even though it was 2 weeks later, his right hand, the hand that had been bleeding, was still heavily bandaged. Ready? He asked his wife. Mrs. Brewer sighed. I guess. She gave Margaret and Casey a helpless look, then moved quickly to give them each one last hug. Let's go then, Dr. Brewer said impatiently. He picked up the 2 bags and groaned. Wow, how long are you planning to stay? A year? Then he headed out the front door with them. not waiting for an answer. Bye, Mrs. Brewer, Diane said, waving. Have a good trip. How can she have a good trip? Casey asked sharply. Her sister's in the hospital. You know what I mean, Diane replied, tossing back her long red hair and rolling her eyes. They watched the station wagon roll down the driveway, then returned to the living room. Casey picked up the remote control and started the movie. Diane sprawled on the couch and picked up the bag of potato chips she'd been eating. Who picked this movie? Diane asked, crinkling the foil bag noisily. I did, Casey said. It's neat. He pulled a couch cushion down to the living room carpet and was lying on it. Margaret was sitting cross legged on the floor, her back against the base of the armchair, still thinking about her mother and her Aunt Eleanor. It's neat if you like to see a lot of people blown up and their guts flying all over, she said, making a face for Diane's benefit. Yeah, it's neat, Casey said, not taking his eyes off the glowing TV screen. I've got so much homework. I don't know why I'm sitting here, Diane said, reaching her hand into the potato chip bag. Me too, Margaret sighed. I guess I'll do it after dinner. Do you have the math assignment? I think I left my math book at school. Shh, Casey hissed, kicking a sneakered foot in Margaret's direction. This is a good part. You've seen this tape before? Diane shrieked. Twice, Casey admitted. He ducked, and the sofa pillow Diane threw sailed over his head. It's a pretty afternoon, Margaret said, stretching her arms above her head. Maybe we should go outside. You know, ride bikes or something. You think you're still back in Michigan? It's always a pretty afternoon here, Diane said, chewing loudly. I don't even notice it anymore. Maybe we should do the math assignment together, Margaret suggested hopefully. Diane was much better in math than she was. Diane shrugged. Yeah, maybe. She crinkled up the bag and set it on the floor. Your dad looked kind of nervous, you know? Huh? What do you mean? Just nervous, Diane said. How's he doing? Shh, Casey insisted, picking up the potato chip bag and tossing it at Diane. You know, being laid off and all. I guess he's okay, Margaret said wistfully. I don't know, really. He spends all his time down in the basement with his experiments. Experiments? Hey, let's go take a look. Tossing her hair back behind her shoulders, Diane jumped up from the chrome and white leather couch. Diane was a science freak. Math and science. The two subjects Margaret hated. She should have been in the Brewer family, Margaret thought, with a trace of bitterness. Maybe Dad would pay some attention to her, since she's into the same things he is. Come on, Diane urged, bending over to pull Margaret up from the floor. He's a botanist, right? What's he doing down there? It's complicated, Margaret said, shouting over the explosions and gunfire on the TV. He tried to explain it to me once, but Margaret allowed Diane to pull her to her feet. Shut up, Casey yelled, staring at the movie, the colors from the TV screen reflecting over his clothes. Is he building a Frankenstein monster or something? Diane demanded. Or some kind of RoboCop. Wouldn't that be cool? Shut up, Casey repeated shrilly as Arnold Schwarzenegger bounded across the screen. He's got all three machines and plants down there, Margaret said uncomfortably. But he doesn't want us to go down there. Huh? It's like top secret? Diane's emerald green eyes lit up with excitement. Come on, we'll just take a peek. No, I don't think so, Margaret told her. She couldn't forget the angry look on her father's face 2 weeks before when she and Casey had tried to pay a visit or the way he had screamed at them never to come down to the basement. Come on, I dare you, Diane challenged. Are you chicken? I'm not afraid, Margaret insisted shrilly. Diane was always daring her to do things she didn't want to do. Why is it so important for Diane to think she's so much braver than everyone else? Margaret wondered. Chicken, Diane repeated, tossing her mane of red hair behind her shoulder. She strode quickly toward the basement door. Diane, stop! Margaret cried, following after her. Hey, wait! Casey cried, clicking off the movie. Are we going downstairs? Wait for me! He climbed quickly to his feet and enthusiastically hurried to join them at the basement door. We can't, Margaret started, but Diane clamped a hand over her mouth. We'll take a quick peek, Diane insisted. We'll just look. We won't touch anything, and then we'll come right back upstairs. Okay, I'll go first, Casey said, grabbing for the doorknob. Why do you want to do this? Margaret asked her friend. Why are you so eager to go down there? Diane shrugged. It beats doing our math, she replied, grinning. Margaret sighed, defeated. Okay, let's go. But remember, just looking, no touching. Casey pulled open the door and led the way onto the stairway, stepping onto the landing. They were immediately engulfed in hot, steamy air. They could hear the buzz and hum of electronic machinery, and off to the right they could see the glare of the bright white lights from Dr. Brewer's workroom. This is kind of fun, Margaret thought, as the three of them made their way down the linoleum covered stairway. It's an adventure. There's no harm in taking a peek. So, why was her heart pounding? Why did she have this sudden tingle of fear? The end of chapter 2, and now we get to start chapter 3. Yuck! It's so hot in here. As they stepped away from the staircase, the air became unbearably hot and thick. Margaret gasped. The sudden change in temperature was suffocating. It's so moist, Diane said. Good for your hair and skin. We studied the rainforest in school, Casey said. Maybe Dad's building a rainforest. Maybe, Margaret said uncertainly. Why did she feel so strange? Was it just because they were invading their father's domain? Doing something he had told them not to do? She held back, gazing in both directions. The basement was divided into two large rectangular rooms. To the left, an unfinished rec room stood in the darkness. She could barely make out the outlines of the ping pong table in the center of the room. The workroom to the right was brightly lit. So bright, they had to blink and wait for their eyes to adjust. Beams of white light poured down from large halogen lamps on tracks in the ceiling. Wow, look, Casey cried, his eyes wide as he stepped excitedly toward the light. Reaching up toward the lights were shiny, tall plants, dozens of them, thick-stalked and broad-leaved, planted close together in an enormous low trough of dark soil. It's like a jungle, Margaret exclaimed, following Casey into the white glare. The plants, in fact, resemble the jungle plants. Leafy vines and tall, tree-like plants with long, slender tendrils, fragile-looking ferns, plants with gnarled, cream-colored roots poking up like bony knees from the soil. It's like a swamp or something, Diane said. Did your father really grow these things in just 5 or 6 weeks? Yeah, I'm pretty sure, Margaret replied, staring at the enormous red tomatoes on a slender yellow stalk. Oh, feel this one, Diane said. Margaret glanced over to find her friend rubbing her hand over a large flat leaf the shape of a teardrop. Diane! We shouldn't touch. I know, Diane said, not letting go of the leaf. But just rub your hand on it. Margaret reluctantly obeyed. It doesn't feel like a leaf, she said as Diane moved over to examine the large fern. It's so smooth, like glass. The three of them stood under the bright white lights, examining the plants for several minutes, touching the thick stalks, running their hands over the smooth, warm leaves, surprised by the enormous size of the fruits some of the plants had produced. It's too hot down here, Casey had complained. He pulled his t shirt off over his head and dropped it onto the floor. What a bod, Diane teased him. He stuck out his tongue at her. Then his pale blue eyes grew wide and he seemed to freeze in surprise. Hey! Casey, what's the matter? Margaret asked, hurrying over to him. This one. He pointed to a tall, tree like plant. It's breathing. Diane laughed. Margaret heard it too. She grabbed Casey's bare shoulder and listened. Yes, she could hear breathing sounds, and they seemed like to be coming from the tall, leafy tree. What's your problem? Diane asked, seeing the amazed expressions on Casey's and Margaret's faces. Casey's right, Margaret said softly, listening to the steady rhythmic sound. You can hear it breathing. Diane rolled her eyes. Maybe it has a cold. Maybe its vine is stuffed up. She laughed at her own joke. But her two companions didn't join in. I don't hear it. She moved closer. All three of them listened. Silence. It stopped, Margaret said. Stop it, you two, Diane scolded. You're not going to scare me. No. Really, Margaret protested. Hey, look at this. Casey had already moved onto something else. He was standing in front of a tall glass case that stood on the other side of the plants. It looked like a phone booth, with a shelf inside about shoulder high and dozens of wires attached to the back and sides. Margaret's eyes followed the wires to a similar glass booth a few feet away. Some kind of electrical generator stood between the two booths and appeared to be connected to both of them. What could that be? Diane asked, hurrying over to Casey. Don't touch it, Margaret warned, giving the breathing plant one final glance, then joining the others. But Casey reached out to the glass door on the front of the booth. I just want to see if this opens, he said. He grabbed the glass, and his eyes went wide with shock. His entire body began to shake and vibrate. His head jerked wildly from side to side. His eyes rolled up in his head. Oh, help! He managed to cry, his body vibrating and shaking harder and faster. Help me, I can't stop! End of chapter 3. And now we begin chapter 4. Surprisingly, these chapters are very short. So, glad we're going through this. Probably not going to be as quick, but we'll go through as many chapters as possible tonight. And then maybe tomorrow or the day after we'll read some more. Help me! Casey's whole body shook as if an electrical current were charging through him. His head jerked on his shoulders, and his eyes looked wild and dazed. Please! Margaret and Diane stared in open-mouthed horror. Margaret was the first to move. She lunged at Cassie and reached out to try to pull him away from the glass. Margaret, don't! Diane screamed. Don't touch him! But we have to do something, Margaret cried. It took both girls a while to realize that Casey had stopped shaking and was laughing. Casey? Margaret asked, staring at him, her terrified expression fading to astonishment. He was leaning against the glass, his body still now, his mouth wrapped in a broad, mischievous grin. Gotcha, he declared, and then began to laugh even harder, pointing at them and repeating the phrase through his triumphant laughter. Gotcha! Gotcha! That wasn't funny, Margaret screamed. You were faking it. I don't believe it, Diane cried, her face as pale as the white lights above them, her lower lip trembling. Both girls leapt onto Casey and pushed him to the floor. Margaret sat on top of him, while Diane held his shoulders down. Gotcha, gotcha, he continued, stopping only when Margaret tickled his stomach so hard he couldn't talk. You rat, Diane cried. You little rat! The free-for-all was brought to a sudden halt by a low moan from across the room. All three kids raised their heads and stared in the direction of the sound. The large basement was silent now except for their heavy breathing. What was that? Diane whispered. They listened. Another low moan, a mournful sound, muffled like air through a saxophone. The tendrils of the tree-like plant suddenly drooped, like snakes lowering themselves to the ground. Another low, sad moan. It's the plants, Casey said, his expression frightened now. He pushed his sister off him and climbed to his feet, brushing back his disheveled blonde hair as he stood up. Plants don't cry and moan, Diane said, her eyes on the vast through trough of plants that filled the room. These do, Margaret said. Tendrils moved like human arms shifting their position. They could hear breathing again, slow, steady breathing. Then a sigh, like air escaping. Let's get out of here, Casey said, edging toward the stairs. It's definitely creepy down here, Diane said, following him, her eyes remaining on the shifting, moaning plants. I'm sure Dad could explain it, Margaret said. Her words were calm, but her voice trembled, and she was backing out of the room, following Diane and Casey. Your dad is weird, Diane said, touching the doorway. No, he isn't, Casey quickly insisted. He's doing important work here. A tall tree-like plant sighed and appeared to bend toward them, raising its tendrils as if beckoning to them, calling them back. Let's just get out of here, Margaret exclaimed. All three of them were out of breath by the time they ran up the stairs. Casey closed the door tightly, making sure it clicked shut. Weird, Diane repeated, playing nervously with a strand of her long red hair. Definitely weird. It was her word of the day, but Margaret had to admit it was appropriate. Well, Dad had warned us not to go down there, Margaret said, struggling to catch her breath. I guess he knew it would look scary to us, and we wouldn't understand. I'm getting out of here, Diane said, only half kidding. She stepped out of the screen door and turned back toward them. Want to go over the math later? Yeah, sure, Margaret said, still thinking about the moaning, shifting plants. Some of them had seemed to be reaching out to them, crying out to them. But of course, that was impossible. Later, Diane said, and headed at a trot down the drive. Just as she disappeared, their father's dark blue station wagon turned the corner and started up the driveway. Back from the airport, Margaret said. She turned from the door, back to Casey, a few yards behind her in the hallway. Is the basement door closed? Yeah, Casey replied, looking again to make sure. No way Dad will know He stopped. His mouth dropped open, but no sound came out. His face went pale. My t-shirt, Casey exclaimed, slapping his bare chest. I left it in the basement. That's the end of chapter 4. Now we get to start chapter 5. I've got to get it, Casey said. Otherwise, Dad'll know. It's too late, Margaret interrupted, her eyes on the driveway. He's already pulled up the drive. It'll only take a second, Casey insisted, his hand on the basement doorknob. I'll run down and run right up. No, Margaret stood tensely in the center of the narrow hallway, halfway between the front door and the basement door, her eyes toward the front. He's parked. He's getting out of the car. But he'll know. He'll know, Casey cried, his voice high and whiny. So? Remember how mad he got last time? Casey asked. Of course I remember, Margaret replied. But he's not going to kill us, He's not going to kill us, Casey. Just because we took a peek at his plants, he's. Margaret stopped. She moved closer to the screen door. Hey, wait! What's going on? Casey asked. Hurry! Margaret turned and gestured with both hands. Go! Get downstairs fast! Mr. Henry from next door. He stopped Dad. They're talking about something in the drive. With a loud cry, Casey flung open the basement door, and disappeared. Margaret heard him clumping rapidly down the stairs. Then she heard his footsteps fade as he hurried into their father's workroom. Hurry, Casey, she thought, standing guard at the front door, watching her father shielding his eyes from the sun with one hand as he looked with Mr. Henry. Hurry! You know, Dad never talks for long with the neighbors. Mr. Henry seemed to be doing all the talking, probably asking Dad some kind of favor, Margaret thought. Mr. Henry wasn't handy at all, not like Dr. Brewer, and so he was always asking Margaret's dad to come over and help repair or install things. Her father was nodding now, a tight smile on his face. Hurry, Casey! Get back up here! Where are you? Still shielding his eyes, Dr. Brewer gave Mr. Henry a quick wave. Then both men spun around and began walking quickly toward their houses. Hurry, Casey! Casey, he's coming! Hurry! Margaret urged silently. It doesn't take this long to pick up your t-shirt from the floor and run up the stairs. It shouldn't take this long. Her dad was on the front walk now. He spotted her in the doorway and waved. Margaret returned the wave and looked back through the hallway to the basement door. Casey, where are you? She called aloud. No reply. No sound from the basement. No sound at all. Dr. Brewer had paused outside to inspect the rose bushes at the head of the front walk. Casey, Margaret called. Still no reply. Casey, hurry! Silence. Her father crouching down, doing something to the soil beneath the rose bushes. With a feeling of dread weighing down her entire body, Margaret realized she had no choice. She had to go downstairs and see what was keeping Casey. That was the end of chapter 5. Now we start chapter 6. Casey ran down the steps, leaning on the metal banister so that he could jump down 2 steps at a time. He landed hard on the cement basement floor and darted into the bright white light of the plant room. Stopping at the entranceway, he waited for his eyes to adjust to the brighter than daylight. He took a deep breath, inhaling the steamy air, and held it. It was so hot down here, so sticky. His back began to itch. The back of his neck tingled. The jungle of plants stood as if at attention under the bright white lights. He saw his t-shirt lying crumpled on the floor a few feet from a tall, leafy tree. The tree seemed to lean toward the t-shirt, its long tendrils hanging down, loosely coiled on the soil around its trunk. Casey took a timid step into the room. Why am I so afraid? He wondered. It's just a room filled with strange plants. Why do I have the feeling that they're watching me, waiting for me? He scolded himself for being so afraid and took a few more steps toward the crumpled t-shirt on the floor. Hey, wait! The breathing! There it was again. Steady breathing. Not too loud, not too soft either. Who could be breathing? What could be breathing? Was the big tree breathing? Casey stared at the shirt on the floor. So near. What was keeping him from grabbing it and running back upstairs? What was holding him back? He took a step forward, then another. Was the breathing growing louder? He jumped, startled by a sudden low moan from the big supply closet against the wall. It sounded so human, as if someone were in there moaning in pain. Casey, where are you? Margaret's voice sounded so far away, even though she was just at the head of the stairs. Okay, so far, he called back to her, but his voice came out in a whisper. She probably couldn't hear him. He took another step. Another. The shirt was about 3 yards away. A quick dash, a quick dive, and he'd have it. Another low moan from the supply closet. A plant seemed to sigh. A tall fern suddenly dipped low, shifting its leaves. Casey? He could hear his sister from upstairs sounding very worried. Casey, hurry! I'm trying, he thought. I'm trying to hurry. What was holding him back? Another low moan, this time from the other side of the room. He took 2 more steps, then crouched low, his arms straight out in front of him. The shirt was almost within reach. He heard a groaning sound, then more breathing. He raised his eyes to the tall tree. The long, ropey tendrils had tensed, stiffened, or had he imagined it? No, they had been drooping loosely. Now they're taut, ready. Ready to grab him? Casey, hurry! Margaret called, sounding even further away. He didn't answer. He was concentrating on the shirt. Just a few feet away. Just a few feet. Just a foot. The plant groaned again. Casey! Casey! The leaves quivered all the way up to the trunk. Just a foot away. Almost in reach. Casey? Are you okay? Answer me! He grabbed the shirt. Two snake-like tendrils swung out at him. Huh? He cried out, paralyzed with fear. What's happening? The tendrils wrapped themselves around his waist. Let's go, he cried. Let go, he cried, holding the t-shirt tightly in one hand, grabbing at the tendrils with the other. The tendrils hung on and gently tightened around him. Margaret? Casey tried calling, but no sound came out of his mouth. Margaret? He jerked violently, then pulled straight ahead. The tendrils held on. They didn't squeeze him. They weren't trying to strangle him or pull him back. But they didn't let go. They felt warm and wet against his bare skin, like animal arms. Not like a plant. Help! He again tried to shout. He pulled once more, leaning forward, using all his strength. No good. He ducked low, hit the floor, tried to roll away. The tendrils hung on. The plant uttered a loud sigh. Let go, Casey cried, finally finding his voice. And then suddenly Margaret was standing beside him. He hadn't heard her come down the stairs. He hadn't seen her enter the room. Casey, she cried. What? Her mouth dropped open and her eyes grew wide. It won't let go, he told her. No, she screamed and grabbed one of the tendrils with both hands and tugged with all her strength. The tendril resisted for only a moment, then went slack. Casey uttered a joyful cry and spun away from the remaining tendril. Margaret dropped the tendril and grabbed Casey's hand and began running toward the stairs. Oh! They both stopped short at the bottom of the stairway. Standing at the top was their father, glaring down at them. His hands balled into tight fists at his sides, his face rigid with anger. Ay. That was the end of chapter 6. We're currently at chapter 7. I could probably read... I could try doing one more chapter tonight before... I'll try to do one more chapter tonight. We'll try it. Dad, the plants, Margaret cried. He stared down at them, his eyes cold and angry, unblinking. He was silent. One grabbed Casey, Margaret told him. I just went down to get my shirt, Casey said, his voice trembling. They stared up at him expectantly, waiting for him to move. to unball his fists, to relax his hard expression, to speak, but he glared down at them for the longest time. Finally, he said, "You're okay?" "Yeah," they said in unison, both of them nodding. Margaret realized she was still holding Casey's hand. She let go of it and reached for the banister. "I'm very disappointed in you both," Dr. Brewer said in a low, flat voice, cool but not angry. "Sorry," Margaret said. "We knew we shouldn't." "We didn't touch anything, really," Casey exclaimed. "Very disappointed," their father repeated. "Sorry, Dad." Dr. Brewer motioned for them to come upstairs. Then he stepped into the hallway. "I thought he was going to yell at us," Casey whispered to Margaret as he followed her up the steps. "That's not Dad's style," Margaret whispered back. "He sure yelled at us the last time we started into the basement," Casey replied. They followed their father into the kitchen. He motioned for them to sit down at the white formica table, then dropped into a chair across from them. His eyes went from one to the other, as if studying them, as if seeing them for the first time. His expression was totally flat, almost robot like, revealing no emotion at all. "Dad, what's with those plants?" Casey asked. "What do you mean?" Dr. Brewer asked. "They're so weird," Casey said. "I'll explain them to you someday," he said flatly, staring at the two of them. "It looks very interesting," Margaret said, struggling to say the right thing. Was their dad trying to make them feel uncomfortable? She wondered. If so, he was doing a good job of it. This wasn't like him, Margaret thought. No, sorry. This wasn't like him. Not at all. He was always a very discreet person. Margaret thought. If he was angry, he said he was angry. If he was upset, he'd tell them he was upset. So why was he acting so strange? So silent? So cold? "I asked you not to go into the basement," he said quietly, crossing his legs and leaning back so that the kitchen chair tilted back on two legs. "I thought I made it clear." Margaret and Casey glanced at each other. Finally, Why won't Margaret said, "We won't do it." "But can't you take us down there and tell us what you're doing?" Casey asked. He still hadn't put the t-shirt on. He was holding it in a ball between his hands on the kitchen table. "Yeah, we'd really like to understand it," Margaret said enthusiastically. "Someday," their father said. He returned to the chair to all four legs, then stood up. "We'll do it soon, okay?" He raised his arms above his head and stretched and stretched. "I've got to get back to work." He disappeared into the front hallway. Casey raised his eyes to Margaret and shrugged. Their father reappeared, carrying the lab coat he had tossed over the front banister. "Mom! Mom got off okay?" Margaret asked. He nodded. "I guess." He pulled on the lab coat over his head. "I hope Aunt Eleanor is okay," Margaret said. Dr. Brewer's reply was muffled as he adjusted the lab coat and straightened the collar. "Later," he said. He disappeared into the hallway. They heard him shut the basement door behind them. "I guess he's not going to ground us or anything for going down there," Margaret said, leaning against the table and resting her chin in her hands. "I guess," Casey said. "He sure is acting weird." "Maybe he's upset because Mom is gone," Margaret said. She sat up and gave Casey a push. "Come on, get up. I've got work to do." "I can't believe that plant grabbed me," Casey said thoughtfully and not budging. "You don't have to push," Casey griped, but he climbed to his feet and stepped out of Margaret's way. I'm going to have bad dreams tonight," he said glumly. "Just don't think about the basement," Margaret advised. He's really That's really lame advice," she told herself. But what else could she say? She went up to her room, thinking about how she missed her mother already. Then the scene then the scene in the basement with Casey trying to pull himself free from the enormous twining plant tendrils played once again through her mind. With a shudder, she grabbed her textbook and threw herself onto her stomach on the bed, prepared to read. But the words on the page blurred as the moaning, breathing plants kept creeping back into her thoughts. At last, at least we're not being punished for going down there, she thought. At least Dad didn't yell and frighten us this time. And at least Dad has promised to take us take us downstairs with him soon, and explain to us what he's working on down there. That thought made Margaret feel a lot better. She felt better until the next morning, when she awoke early and went downstairs to make some breakfast. To her surprise, her father was already at work. The basement door was shut tight, and a lock had been installed on the door. The next Saturday afternoon, Margaret was up in her room, lying on top of the bed, talking to her mom on the phone. I'm really sorry about Aunt Eleanor, she said, twisting the white phone cord around her wrist. The surgery didn't go as well as expected, her mother said, sounding very tired. The doctors say she may have to have more surgery, but we have to build up her strength first. I guess this means you won't be coming home real soon, Margaret said sadly. Mrs. Brewers laughed. Don't tell me you actually miss me. Well, yes, Margaret admitted. She raised her eyes to the bedroom window. Two sparrows had landed outside of the window ledge and were chattering excitedly, distracting Margaret, making it hard to hear her mother over the crackling line from Tucson. How's your father doing? Mrs. Brewer asked. I spoke to him last night, but he only grunted. He doesn't have even grunt to us, Margaret complained. She held her hand over her ear to drown out the chattering birds. He already says a word. He's working really hard, Mrs. Brewer replied. In the background, Margaret could hear some kind of loudspeaker announcement. Her mother was calling from a payphone at the hospital. He never comes out of the basement, Margaret complained, a little more bitterly than she had intended. Your father's experiments are very important to him, her mother said. More important than we are. Than we are? Margaret cried. She hated the whiny tone in her voice. She wished she hadn't started complaining about her dad over the phone. Her mother had enough to worry about at the hospital. Margaret knew she shouldn't make her feel even worse. Your dad has a lot to prove, Mrs. Brewer said, to himself and to others. I think he's working so hard because he wants to prove Mr. Martinez and the others at the university that they were wrong to fire him. He wants to show them that they made a big mistake. But we used to see him before he was home all the time, Margaret complained. She could hear her mother sigh impatiently. Margaret, I'm trying to explain to you. You're old enough to understand. I'm sorry, Margaret said quickly. She decided to change the subject. He's wearing a baseball cap all of a sudden. Who? Casey? No, Mom, Margaret replied. Dad. He's wearing a Dodgers cap. He never takes it off. Really? Mrs. Brewer sounded very surprised. Margaret laughed. We told him he looks really dorky in it, but he refuses to take it off. Mrs. Brewer laughed too. Uh-oh, I'm being called, she said. Got to run. Take care, dear. I'll try to call you back later. A click, and she was gone. Margaret stared up at the ceiling, watching shadows from trees in the front yard, moved back and forth. The sparrows had flown away, leaving silence behind. Poor Mom, Margaret thought. She's so worried about her sister, and I had to go and complain about Dad. Why did I do that? She sat up, listening to the silence. Casey was over at a friend's. Her dad was no doubt working in the basement, the door carefully locked behind him. Maybe I'll give Diane a call, Margaret thought. She reached for the phone, then realized she was hungry. Lunch first, she decided, then Diane. She brushed her dark hair quickly, shaking her head at the mirror over her dressing table, then hurried downstairs. To her surprise, her dad was in the kitchen. He was huddled over the sink, his back to her. She started to call out to him, but stopped. What was he doing? Curious, she pressed against the wall, gazing at him through the doorway to the kitchen. Dr. Brewer appeared to be eating something. With one hand, he was holding a bag on the counter beside the sink. As Margaret watched in surprise, he dipped his hand into the bag, pulled out a big handful of something, and shoved it into his mouth. Margaret watched him chew hungrily, noisily, then pulled out another handful from the bag and eat it greedily. What on earth is he eating? She wondered. He never eats with Casey and me. He always says he isn't hungry, but he sure is hungry now. He acts as if he's starving. She watched from the doorway as Dr. Brewer continued to grab handful after handful from the bag, gulping down the solitary meal. After a while, she crinkled up the bag and tossed it into the trash can under the sink. Then he wiped his hands off on the sides of his white lab coat. Margaret quickly backed away from the door and tiptoed through the hall and ducked into the living room. She held her breath as her father came into the hall, clearing his throat loudly. The basement door closed behind him. She heard him carefully lock it. When she was sure that he had gone downstairs, Margaret walked eagerly into the kitchen. She had to know what her father had been eating so greedily, so hungrily. She pulled open the sink cabinet, reached into the trash, and pulled out the crinkled up bag. Then she gasped aloud as her eyes ran over the label. Her father, she saw, had been devouring plant food. And that was the end of chapter 7. So we'll stop at chapter 8 for right now. We'll continue this tomorrow. So that was 7 chapters in about an hour's time. Not bad. That was a lot of pages we've gone through too. We read... How many pages was that? We're at page 46. That was 45 pages we read tonight. Not bad for a first start. But we will be doing some more reading tomorrow night. And we'll find out more about what's going on with her dad. Why her dad's eating plant food. And maybe there'll be some more explanations as to that. Or why the kids are feeling a sense of fear. Who knows, maybe the kids are plants too. We'll have to wait and see. Until then, if you like this video, please like and subscribe. And we'll do our best to keep on posting nightly if possible. And if you guys want to make a comment on the book, or if you guys are excited about the series, please let me know down below and make a comment, and I'll see your messages soon. Until then, until our next video, I'm Loyal Hufflepuff, and we'll see you all next time.